So it's me and Ali. We're here. We're starting our podcast. We hop on the phone every single day. Well, no, not every single day, but every time we hop on the phone, it's damn near like an hour, 2 hour conversation. And we really were supposed to do this a long time ago. So now we're finally starting. Ali, if you want to say anything to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the spaceship.
Welcome to the crib. Welcome to the spaceship. So, for this first episode, we're gonna do like an introductory, kind of to just give a little bit of sauce on who it is that we are, both individually, and then kind of maybe more into what we plan to do with this podcast, or just even why we're making a podcast in general. So I'll start off. My name is D'Angelo. I was born in Alaska. I'm from the cold. And so the premise or the one question we wanted to come and ask within this introductory is what got us into spirituality, or kind of what pushed us towards spirituality. And so for me growing up, I kind of always was spiritual. And by kind of, I mean like I wore a mask. And so I often speak about wearing masks to kind of interact with the world and kind of remain as a hidden person, almost to say subjugating yourself to third parties, but that mask being what protects that hidden personality. And so for me, my hidden personality was the fact that I was very spiritual. Everything that happened in my life as a kid, I would always like keep away from my parents and my friends just because I felt like they really couldn't, I wouldn't say handle it, but almost to say like they look at you like you're a little crazy, or look at you like you're different. And honestly, I was already looked at that, so I was like, I'm kind of trying to avoid that as much as I can. um, but the one thing I like to get off the bat is I like to look at the worldly and I like to look at the spiritual, and I kind of look at them as two different things, if you will. And so in the worldly, I feel like is where a lot of people are, and even myself at one time. And so getting or transitioning to the spiritual, I like to refer to that as awakening or remembering. And so before I was awakened, or I remembered things, I was very much a person who was like always on the go, always looking into every little thing that was coming to me. Like I have quote quote ADHD, or even to say autism. I don't necessarily believe in those things anymore now, but just in the worldly, to speak about those things, those are qualities and traits that I possessed. And so for me, I noticed every little single thing. And so just before we even started recording, I was telling Ollie that I actually, and I see angel numbers, and that'll be a present theme throughout our podcast. But I always would look at numbers growing up, especially as a young kid. And I specifically remember this, like I'll never forget this. Obviously, I'll never forget it. It's my life. But as a young person, I would be in math class, and I actually had a learning disability plan growing up. And I was so stupid, you could say, that I would literally just look at the numbers on the page and I would reduce them down, almost like a Fibonacci. And Ollie brought up a good point that in the moment of these things, obviously, I didn't know that they were spiritual or that they maybe even had purpose. But in the retrospect, when you're able to look back and kind of connect the pieces and say, like, okay, that was that, or that's where I've always done that, or that makes sense why I always kind of had an irkling to do that. That's kind of how I've pieced my life together and remembered, or woken up. And so, specifically around COVID time, 2020, I started really paying attention to the things that were going on. And I think that's kind of and we'll probably have to talk about that too, Ollie. And I want to hear your experience around that time as well. But that was probably a time where a lot of people were having their awakenings and just kind of becoming hip to things that were going on. But for me specifically, that's when things really started to pick up. I really started seeing angel numbers a lot. I started having prophetic dreams. And even just to say in the worldly and the material, I was seeing things that I felt like weren't real, is not the word to describe it, but just that it was like, almost to say like this, like imagine you wake up one day and then something's just in your house and you're just like, how the fuck this get in my house? Like, what the fuck? Like, that's almost what these occurrences that I had in my life were like. And so I knew that they had some sort of spiritual meaning, or some sort of just meaning in general, but I didn't necessarily have an answer for what it was, more that I was just experiencing it and seeing it. And so that was kind of what pushed me to my spirituality more, was specifically the COVID. and kind of just noticing everything that was going on. A lot of things really weren't settling with me. Even just to say, the riots and stuff like that were going on, I felt like there had to be a hand that was playing in it, not that it was just occurrences that were happening. So yeah, that's my answer.
Amazing. Nice to meet you, D'Angelo.
Yes, sir.
Great. So I do want to touch on the COVID thing because it's we're both on threads and I've seen it multiple times. Um, a lot of people have come to the awakening through COVID, and I see why. Because for me, for example, before COVID, I was very much like many other people, and still to this day, entertained daily, 24/7 by something else, right? No time for, what is that called? Introspective time, no time for silence. Even though I did keep a journal throughout college, but it was more like day-to-day thing instead of like deep thinking. So COVID allowed us, for as much bad as it brought, it allowed us to have that moment of silence that we all needed. And combined with the riots, we started to really question things such as is what is the nature of the government, for example. That's one rabbit hole that a lot of people went into. But just what is the nature of everything? Why do we even have jobs? I remember that was the biggest one for me. And why do I even want a degree? Because at that point I was 2 years into college. Why do I want a degree? Why do I want a career? And I started to be more honest with myself because pre-COVID, I would just like take everything that was told to me and just take it at face value, not really question it. Because, I mean, based on how I was raised, I was taught to never question authority, which is a very dangerous thing to teach a kid. Um, but I started to question all of these things and not seeking an answer, really just the fact that things were that way, that we were under very specific structures and we took them for normal. We didn't have pushback until the riots, when we started to see that people not realize, people were accepting that things are not okay. That for as much as the government wants to portray a certain picture, we know better. And so all of that combined with my own personal journey, which is pre-COVID, I was a closeted queer guy, but which is funny in retrospect because I never hid myself away. My queer nature, I guess, my effeminate traits, but I was never open about it. So it put me on this weird in-between position that I was always hyper aware of how I was perceived by other people, but never really confronted that. And so COVID also helped me to confront that. But it was like a dark night of the soul kind of thing where I completely crashed down to my family and I had to open up. I had to come out to everybody because I couldn't handle it anymore. I was reflecting all day long, doing nothing but just thinking, and I really got to the core of my problems and started asking myself, why do I keep on doing these things that I know I don't want for myself? So that was kind of my awakening, but not in a spiritual sense, more in like I really understood that I was an individual, which before that, because I've come from a Mexican family, it's not really a thing. You're not an individual, you're just a part of a unit of the community. And so after that, I came to California and I was really into self-help books, which eventually led me to spirituality books. And I started to open up much more to the unseen or the unknowable, things that like, we call them mysteries, I guess, but it's things that are there, like ghost phenomena and all of that, which I'm not interested in, but it's part of it. All of these things that like we wonder what's out there, but we don't know the answers. And I truly believe that we cannot know them, we can only guess. I've started to become more open to that. And the more I allow myself to receive these kind of, well, ask these kind of questions, I allow myself to receive the answers too. But not to say the answers to the questions themselves, but how those questions apply to my experience. Um, and I think that's it. Because there's so much more to the story, of course, but that's an overall what I've been going through. Um, the spiritual awakening didn't really come until I started doing yoga, though. And I learned that yoga is not just stretchy, bendy postures, it's an actual system of how to look at life in a quote unquote objective manner, putting labels to everything that encompasses being a human, which completely broke my mind. And I fell in love. Before that, I was trying to be a therapist, but I completely gave that up because it this is my personal opinion, it seems pretty phony now to believe that you can help other people by guiding them through their problems. um, I see it now as the only help you can provide to others is being completely honest about your opinion and having them reflect on their own opinion and find their own answers. Anyways, that's the shift that I went through. Because it also involved all of that self-questioning that I went through in COVID. Like, why do I even want a career? Why do I want this specific career? Why do I want to work in the first place? Why do we need to work in such structures that are detrimental to us, like the 9 to 5? Um, and yeah, it all started with like sitting down and starting to question things around me.
And that was for me too. Definitely around that COVID time, there was one thing I actually was writing about in my book. And even just looking it up on the internet, as I was looking it up, I was like, I won't find any information to corroborate what it is that I'm saying, or what it is that I'm looking for. But there was this, and I remember this very vividly. Like, I will not forget this. There was a lady who was involved in the Sandy Hook shooting. And by involved, I mean she just was like a parent of one of the either one of the students that had passed away or just a student in general who was involved. And so she was speaking. And that same lady, who I remember just from that, was literally a big piece and then when I say big piece, I'm remembering her at a police conference and she was speaking for the George Floyd incident. And so that's something that made me look into crisis actors, which is something I had never even one knew about, just and call it what it is. I didn't even know about a crisis actor, but two made me really start to question, like, why is that even a thing? Like, what would a crisis actor be? Like, why would there be an actor when there's a crisis going on? And so that in my mind just is like an oxymoron. And so for those who don't know what oxymoron is, it means something that contradicts itself in and of itself. And so if you just think of it, crisis and actor, why would anybody be acting during a crisis? That's just what was going on through my mind. But you bring up this point of questioning the nature of the government. And so that's something that I heavily started doing as well, just because my personal experience during COVID was I actually was a COVID tester, and vaccinator slash, well, I wasn't necessarily the vaccinator, but I would pretty much copy down or inscribe all the information for the vaccinator, from the different patients that were coming. And so the one thing that I tell everybody that I just had this thought pop in my head. I don't know if I should share it. I'll say it's an unofficial thing. I'm not saying I did do this or didn't do this, but there's a potential situation where there might have been some cards that were given out that necessarily weren't real. Now, if I was a participant to have one or not, I'm not saying I was or I wasn't. But one thing that I always say is that these cards were just left out in the open. And so I mean, I went to school. I wanted to be a homicide detective growing up. So not that that necessarily has any correlation, but just the fact of procedure, right? Like there's things that are done in an orderly manner. And so when I was working at this job, I just think to myself, like, COVID is so big. and not even to say so big, but COVID is such a big thing. Obviously, it shut down the whole country. Why are these cards just out like that? That's what my mind would be thinking. And even to say just our testing procedures as well, they were very of course, things change facility to facility or just program to program, company to company, but it wasn't necessarily something that was in house that was the problem, more just of the overall testing of itself. And so I remember when I actually first got back home, I was in college, and so COVID happened and they sent everybody back home. But I remember going to get the test and they shoved it all the way down my nose. And then they came to find out, like, okay, well, you didn't even have to really, shove it that deep. And speaking as someone who was testing for COVID, like, I'll tell you, I would barely rim around a person's nose and it would pop as positive. But then you could go to the other nostril and do it and it would pop as negative. And so it was just little things like that that made me think, like, how, and of course they came out with all the different findings of, like, okay, this is how quickly COVID can spread and all that kind of stuff. But it just really made me reflect in that time, like, what's really going on? Because everything that's being perpetuated on the news isn't necessarily the experience that I'm having. And obviously, like, things are different everywhere. But as someone who, I don't want to say was on the front line because that sounds a little corny, but just to call it what it is, like, I was testing people for COVID every day. It just, some things weren't making sense. And so then you bring up this point of journaling, and that's actually something I got into very recently. I never really journaled before that. I would always try, but just to call it what it is, I kind of felt like it was a little corny as well. Just to kind of sit there and write down the things that I thought, because one, I was like, when am I ever going to go back and look at this? But since becoming so, I don't want to say becoming so spiritual, because it's of my belief that everything is spiritual in life. Everything is spiritual in nature. So, not that I became so spiritual, but I like to say awoke, that I woke back up. Since waking up, I've realized the importance of journaling. And so I wanted to ask you, Ollie, one, what is it that you journal about or you find the most important thing to journal about? But also, two, what made you realize the distinction of, like, okay, I should journal more about the thing, like you said, like an introspective thought, as opposed to just like, oh, I went to the dentist and this happened, and okay, this happened with me at my friend's house. Like, what made you start to say, okay, I want to really write things down that I'm kind of dealing with in an introspective manner?
So I've always been a YouTube kid. I grew up on YouTube, and any advice that I needed, I would always ask YouTube, essentially. Um, and one of the things when I started to wonder about journaling, because I knew that I had a lot of things in my mind that I needed to channel somehow, but I didn't feel safe enough around my family, essentially, or my friends, to share them um, with them. So I read about journaling, and then I watched videos on journaling, and one of them mentioned, and this is how I started journaling, that you're essentially talking to your no, you're talking to your future self. You're having a conversation between your present and future and past selves. So that kind of broke my mind, and I started to write, knowing that I will go back to these. And so it was at first just like, this is what happened today, blah blah blah. But then eventually, as the more I practice, because there's kind of a bump, a learning bump, where you start and then, like you said, it feels corny, but that's like your inner saboteur or inner critic. And once you're able to conquer that, to just keep on doing it regardless, something kind of morphs. You start to see the intention behind what you're doing. And for me, it started to be more like, oh, wait, I've dealt with this before, but I never really noticed it. So let me write about it. And then whenever I came to the same problem, I would go back and understand, it's the exact same situation, but under different scenarios. Um, which is essentially, when we talk about like spiritual quote unquote powers, which we all have, but some of us are more attuned to them, to very specific ones based on our lived in experience. That's one of my most accessible ones, is recognizing the patterns of life situations in general. Because you kind of need that to be a therapist, and it's what I was training to do. You need to recognize the patterns in everyday life and understand, well, if you don't change something, it's gonna repeat itself. So I guess that's my answer to your question. Did I get it? Did I answer it before I
Hmm.
keep on rambling?
And so I want to ask another question within that. When did you start to realize that the system wasn't necessarily, um, to say what it was, that sounds a little like, open-ended in a way, but I know you understand what I'm saying. When did you start to realize that the system wasn't necessarily what you thought it was, or maybe a better way to put it is what everybody thinks that it is?
Ooh, oh, I love this question. This is like, I really want to write a book on this. Um, so, I come from Mexico. I'm an immigrant. And the thing about Mexico is that our politicians are overtly corrupt. Like, they don't even try to hide it. However, in America, it's been a whole play that, yes, the politicians are for the people, which is phony and untrue, but they've been doing a really good job at disguising it. But COVID put everything on the front line, on the forefront, I'm sorry, and it's impossible to ignore it now. However, because of where I come from and how blatant our politicians were, it was very easy to spot for me. Uh, and that's another thing about me. I like to just notice things, observe things, and draw conclusions. And that experience, that part of me, knowing that like everything has a reason, and I know that I know a phony man when I see one. Like that mask doesn't phase me because I didn't grow up with that. Like I grew up knowing that you can just call that bullshit out. But that combined with my music taste, which is I know that it's kind of a weird um, line to draw, but my favorite artist is Solange Knowles, which is Beyonce's sister, and one of her albums is A Seat at the Table, in which is it's a piece of art if you haven't listened to it, and it really narrates the experience of the Black American under the government. Well, not necessarily under the government specifically, but like what it means to be a Black American in this century, and how history has, like, you can't put the past in the past. It has effects on the present. And her music, her artistry opened me up to a world that I was not part of because I'm not black, but because I'm an immigrant, it was a very similar experience. And like one of the songs is "Where Do We Go," and it talks about like this is my home, but I don't feel at home because I'm made to be felt. Oh my god, I can't say that. I am. I feel like a foreigner in my own home, essentially, and that song has stuck with me forever. So, just like learning about her music process and just all the interviews that she puts in the actual album, like people talking about experiencing the first reintegration of, you know how schools used to be segregated, and one of the songs, one of the first people who, one of the first kids that went into a white school is telling his story. And that, like, it breaks me down every time that I listen to it because it's so real and it feels very much kin to what it felt like to come into America and having to assimilate into this phony society, as somebody who had a whole life before that. So yeah, it's all connected, I guess. But like, my to answer the question is like, to me, it's very clear all the phoniness and theatrics of politics. But I understand from an American perspective because that's what they've been fed their whole life. It's like mind breaking, but it's not when you really think about it, which is what COVID kind of forced us to do.
Right. And I think honestly, that's a great point that you brought up is being a foreigner in your own home. And that's one that relates to me, or rather that I resonate with so much. And not necessarily from a point of like, government making me, because, and I want to put this out there too. I'm from Alaska, and so if I had to say I dealt with any kind of like hood stuff, or even like the politicky black-esque, racism, not really. Not, I mean, maybe a little bit in school, like get called this name or whatever, and not even like that, like more as a joke, if anything. I never had that kind of experience, but my experience to being a foreigner in my own home was really like living in my body as someone who is very spiritual, and everybody around me just ain't, to call it what it is. And so I always was like a psychic, intuitive, medium, a witch, a shaman, whatever you want to call it. Like, there's all kind of names for it. Even people just call it crazy people. But I always was that. And so my friends, all of them are like almost Christian. I got some Muslim friends. I've even got friends that are from India, and they practice like Buddhism or Hinduism. And so for me, it's like when I hear that statement, foreigner in your own body, it kind of makes me think of like being trapped inside, and this is something we'll have to speak about specifically, um, but being a prisoner inside of a cage with no bars, because you can leave at any time that you want, but really the bars are what's set in your mind, and your mind is what's trapping you. But the reason you're trapped is because you're so scared to overcome what it is that you continuously feed yourself. And for me, that was just like, that mask creating, because, and for me, I was a basketball player, right? So I'll kind of just give a specific example. None of my basketball teammates are spiritual at all, or at least not to my knowledge. Maybe they were, right? Not to say they weren't, but the outward impression that they were giving was not one that was spiritual. It was very endorsed into religion, heavily religious. And so for me, that just never was my life, specifically because the things that I experienced, and obviously so, being a spiritual being. Um, but anyways, so another point or another topic that I would like to press into is, what is spirituality and what does it mean to you? And so to answer this one pretty quickly, for me, spirituality is the practice of coming back to yourself and connecting to yourself. And what does it mean? I really feel like you can't define what it means, because there's a meaning that's different for everyone, because everybody objectively, or rather subjectively, has their own opinions and own truths of their own life experiences. And so for me, if you had to ask what does spirituality mean, I would say finding humility and peace within yourself, because honestly in life, I feel like that's all that we ever look to do, is find humility and find peace. Why do you work a job? So you can have comfort of living. Why do you go to school? So you can have that job to have comfort of living. So for me, the answer always boils back to those two things: humility and finding peace. So in the end, I would say that spirituality is the practice of returning to yourself and finding those two things.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Mine is very similar when I try to define spirituality, which is very important to, I guess, highlight that any word we use is going to be, there's no like one definition. I truly don't believe that there's subjectivity in this life, at least not as a human, right? Everything that we define or talk about is completely going to come from our perspective, which makes it subjective. However, we can have like colloquial understanding of what a word means, but ultimately is going to be informed by your
What
lived
was that word?
experience.
Say that again.
Which one?
Repeat your whole sentence. That was a real smart word. I gotta write that word down. Colloquial.
Colloquially, it just means like in a group, I suppose. Yeah, agreed upon by a group. Colloquial.
How you spell that? COLQ.
It has two L's. COLLOQUIEL. No, no. UIAL. Colloquial.
Fun fact about me, I love looking words up. So anytime I hear a good word, I'm like, I need that. That was a good word. Anyways, I'm sorry.
It's okay. So my definition would be, I like to separate it into two, and this is because when I got introduced to spirituality, it was through this YouTuber called Teal Swan, which I love her perspective. And she divides spirituality into 1.0 and 2.0, and these are just terms. But the first part is essentially questioning and what we call the awakening, and understanding that you are a human, but what does that mean to you? So it's all about questioning who am I, and receiving the answers, really, because you can't really define who you are in one sentence or with one definition. It always changes. And then the second part is being that, grounding yourself so much in knowing who you are, and then actually being that, letting nothing external deter you from who you are and what you're here to do. um, and yeah, that would be my definition for spirituality, which is essentially what you said, the practice of coming back to yourself.
And one thing that's on my mind too, and feel free to interject with any questions that you want to ask me, is what does a mask mean to you? For me, I always give this example of like the third party, and I'll kind of break that down. Um, and on a check, right? I know this is like we're talking spirituality, now we're talking money. On a check, there's a thing where, well, how should I break this down? I will, yeah, okay, I'll stick with this example. So if bank one is where you're putting your money, you are one party, bank one is one party, and bank two is another party. So say if Ollie went with Bank of America, I had Chase Bank, I would take my money and put it in Chase Bank and then give it to Bank of America for Ollie. That's a three-person, we'll just call it activity. The third person is the person we're looking to intervene with or have some kind of discourse with. The mask that I'm wearing is the chase. It's like, why don't I just give the money to Bank of America myself?
Right.
Well, I need a mask in order to do that. I need a quote, quote, transmitting vessel or utility. And so for me, when I'm looking at this example, the transmitting utility or the mask that I wear is how I interact with the world. Or just in the example of giving the money from Chase to Bank of America, I am giving my quote, quote, feelings, aka this mask, this persona, whatever it is, to whatever party it is that I'm looking to, I guess you could say, interact with. And so again, kind of just back to the basketball example. I mean, there would just be so many times like I'm thinking certain things, or like, certain things are cool to me, or I do certain things that aren't really cool to other people, and I'm just like, man, I got to wear this fucking mask all fucking day. So I want to ask you, Ollie, what is your not to say experience with wearing a mask, but one, well, yeah, actually, I'll ask that. What's your experience with wearing masks? But then two, what does that even mean to you in general to wear a mask?
All right, great question. So I have a psychology background, and Jung, Carl Jung, oh my God, I can't give enough credit to that guy. He defines the persona, which is the mask of the ego. And to me, what it means to have a mask means it's just an experience-based thing. You know, when you have that feeling of I'm not being honest, and you don't have to like associate it with any guilt or anything, but you know when you're not being honest, when you're not being your true self. It's all of these reactions and narratives that we put up in order to be accepted by others. So that's what I define as the mask. This act, if you will, this facade that you put up, even though it's unconscious, it's us putting it up, in order to be accepted, to be socially accepted by others. Because it's a lot of people like to say that you have to transcend the ego or kill it or anything, but I truly believe that we can't live without it. So my experience on the mask thing, like I said before, I was closeted for a long time, even though it's so funny every time that I say it, because I'm not the type to like, if you ever met me you would know that I'm queer, but the thing is that I had this idea that I couldn't be openly queer because it's not socially acceptable, which is the paradigm that I come from. I know that it's not as much of a problem right now in the modern age, but especially since I came from a small town in Mexico, I had to literally be a whole other human being in front of others in order to not be endangered. Which is, it's so crazy to think about this because I haven't dealt with like problems about my queerness in years. Um, but back then it was like life or death kind of thing. So I really had to put up a whole front in order to not be quote unquote found out. And another thing to say about the persona is that, or the mask, is that there's many things in society that we deem unworthy or ugly or unredeemable, all of these concepts. And so you have many of those. Everybody does. But the thing is that we all want to fit in. We all want to be accepted. We're social creatures. And so, in order to be accepted, quote unquote, which is not truly being accepted if it's conditional, but we like to pretend, in order to be accepted, you have to hide those things away. Uh, and so for me, one of those was my queerness. Another one was how how disgusted I am by like a lot of human behavior, but I can't express that because it'll get me in trouble. For example, a lot of people like to just talk shit about other people in front of me, and I know that if I'm like, that doesn't fly with me. What are you doing? Who do you think you are to talk like that about anybody else? It will cause a lot of trouble. So that's another experience that I've been recently dealing with, as far as my persona, is that I've always had to be the nice person, the person to keep the peace, because that was my role in my family. But I'm not that. That's not me. I really do feel like a phony every time that I have to like silence myself in order to keep the peace. And that's where I'm at in my journey as far as a persona, the mask. And that's just all to say that like we know who we are, but the thing is that we've been conditioned, we've been quote unquote forced to put up a front in order to be accepted by others. But it's all just a front, and it always goes away. That's the thing. That's something else that I wanted to mention. I've been able to not have to put a persona with certain people, and so the very fact that I can be those quote unquote two different people, it just goes to show me that one of them is not honest, and that's the persona, the person that I had to be, the nice guy that I had to be to everybody else in order to not feel rejected. That was a long answer.
No, but I hear you though, and I have the same similar experience, except mine is just the fact of hiding the spirituality. And so even when you say like keeping the peace and keeping your tongue, I mean that right there is something I feel like everybody who you could maybe use the term chosen one, or even just to say black sheep of their family would relate to, you know, and especially for me, like I've been in so many predicaments where it's like the true authenticity of me is what I'm hiding and holding back. And I create this mask to interact with people because it's like if I don't, they're not going to like what I have to say. And I know that. And so then I run into the same problem, or I should say, ran into the same problem because I'm really not dealing with this one too much anymore. Well, not to say I'm not dealing with it. You know, it comes and it goes, but it was one that was like, how do I function around people? Well, how should I put this? You know, for you, for example, our relationship, I'm unfiltered. You know, I'm gonna say what I want to say. I would say the way that I act to you is the way I act around a lot of people now. But the people that I don't act that way around, it's hard for me to navigate. How do I even go about this relationship, or how do I even go about dealing with them? Just because, as you were saying, it's almost like filtering yourself down, or watering yourself down. And obviously, it's like, why would you want to water yourself down when you can shine so bright? When I say shine so bright, I don't mean like shine brighter than someone else, but shine at your most well, how should I put this? Shining at the highest capacity that you can shine at, regardless of somebody else. You're not focused on the other people, but you trying to water yourself down is then creating your light to be more dim. And it's like, why are you trying to make your light, you know, dim when it's everything we do in life is to look to make it the brightest? So it's almost like an internal push and pull every day when I find myself around those individuals. And then that's to say that's not even just family for me. I mean, that can be a roommate, That could be a close friend that I grew up with. Obviously, family. That could even be just someone in the grocery store. There's a lot of places that I find myself in that predicament. So I most definitely relate there.
Yeah, yeah. And it's important to understand that, like, it's not bad to have a persona. The thing is, we all have it, but many of us do fall under. Our persona is formed by trauma responses. Many of us. So the way that we interact with other people, it's kind of nasty. The way that we like just unconsciously hide ourselves or reject ourselves or judge others. Um, and I think it's very important to recognize that you can actually um, edit it, I guess, but it takes a lot of awareness and acceptance. And like I said before, I don't think we can ever live without a persona. And for example, even just going out and interacting with strangers, uh, they don't know you fully. So, like, to them, that's you. Your persona is you. But that's because there's no connection there. They're strangers.
So, do you have any questions you want to ask? Get some elaboration going.
Hmm.
That's a no.
I
Okay.
guess not.
Well, that's it for me. I'm good there. I think we could call it good there on the first episode. And as these episodes unfold, we'll have more, I guess you could say, bullet pointed topics. This was just one to kind of get us in the rhythm of going, slash get you guys used to our voices, slash even just us to say. So, with that being said, I guess we'll sign off here. And this is D'Angelo and Ollie, our first episode on our podcast. Welcome to the spaceship. Maybe ooh, that should be the name right there. Welcome to the spaceship. I like that. Um, and yeah, so that's it. You got any message you want to give before we sign off?
Authenticity is key, and honesty comes with it. Liars do not heal, and that's by Candace Love on Instagram. Look her up.
I like that. And even honestly, I'll sign off with this. I really like this, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next episode. When you said our persona is formed by our trauma responses, I really like that quote. That was pretty deep. Um, but all right, then, yeah, we'll call it there. You folks have a good night, morning, afternoon, whatever it is for you while you listen to this. Have a good shit if you're sitting on the toilet taking the poop. Um, yeah.
All right. Signing off. And